me. How you gonna say that you don't care? Living this life every day. Now we gotta show that we all care. It doesn't have to be that way. How you gonna sit there watching? Boy, you better stand to your feet. Don't let me catch you sleeping. Stop sleeping. We gotta keep the beat. I heard them say.
Hey y'all, it's Classic Ruby and I'm back. I switched up my location. This is one of those giant wall panels you can actually buy from Home Depot, and then I kind of jazzed it up myself. I am personally, with my own two little hands, I'm renovating my whole house because I had all the wisdom in the world of ripping apart a house first and then figuring out how I was going to put it back together after. But I'm also not only am I really picky and exacting with everything I want to do, but I'm also super, super cheap. So yeah, it's been a really great, I'm going to say 11-ish months of renovating. I think the things that I have accomplished, like the wall, are definitely amazing. I think that I wish I hadn't ripped apart so much of the house all at once. But yeah, anyway, so one of the things that, I mean, if you know me at all, you know that psychology is not just the thing that I am pursuing in school. It's actually my passion. It's the thing that I love most. I could, whether or not I ever pursued a career in psychology, I could study it forever. I think human behavior and the human psyche is fascinating. And I also think, though, that a firm grasp in psychology really helps you to understand both yourself and other people. And it helps you to, I guess, figure out what's going wrong in your interactions maybe, or in the things that you're observing, and it really helps you make sense of those things. And I feel like when you can make sense of those things, it's a lot easier to figure out solutions for those things. So what I would like to do, I'm thinking probably weekly, I don't know, obviously all of this is new to me, is I want to kind of address one major theme or concept or definition in the psychology world, kind of give you a little explanation of it, kind of apply it to maybe one or two real world examples, and then yeah, hopefully that will be kind of helpful, whether it's the actual examples I give you that help, or whether it's just the definition and your ability to apply it to something else you've been working on or trying to figure out or whatever, I don't know. So this week I would like to cover the fundamental attribution error. Oh, I kind of feel like I'm on Sesame Street. Okay, so I wanted to make sure I got it right, so I actually grabbed my textbook, social psych textbook. This one is by a bunch of people, but it's the Canadian edition. It's the 5th Canadian edition, which is irrelevant because the terms are the same no matter where you are. But anyway, so covering the fundamental attribution error. So it's a really long term, but I'm going to explain what it is. So the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which people's behavior stems from internal dispositional factors and to underestimate the role of situational factors. To kind of expound on that definition that's in this textbook, basically, we have a tendency as human beings to attribute, say, negative factors or negative behaviors, negative things that we do. We tend to attribute that when we're talking about ourselves to external factors. And when we're talking about someone else or observing someone else outside of our circle, we tend to say it's about them. So giving you an example, let's say, you cut someone off accidentally because you're late for work and, you weren't paying attention. You had a long night because you were up with the baby all night and da-da-da-da-da. And then, you cut this guy off. He nearly has to hit you. And then he's all angry and he's screaming, watch how to drive, you women drivers, and da-da-da-da-da. And you're like, what a dick. Can't he see, obviously, the baby's in the car and, or my eyes are bloodshot. Obviously, it was an accident, right? And so we walk away from that interaction thinking the other person's such a jerk for yelling at us, like, obviously, it was a mistake. But when someone cuts us off, we do the exact same thing. And we're saying, wow, that guy's such a jerk. Like, how dare he cut me off? Like, oh my God, learn how to drive. The streets won't be safe unless all those people are off the road. So we do the same thing, and it's like a really small but very common example, and it really does go to illustrate how prevalent this attribution error is. So that kind of ties us right into, again, this concept of correspondence bias, which is the tendency to infer that people's behavior corresponds to or matches their disposition or personality. So not only are we going to attribute whatever we're seeing and in these negative factors, we're going to attribute that to what that person's personality. But what we're going to do is if we see negative behavior from someone, we're actually going to paint that person now as that negative behavior or that negative disposition. So again, the guy who cut me off, who, I'm like, he's a jerk and he's irresponsible and, he's probably a drunk or whatever. And I actually do walk away from that interaction thinking that he is generally an unpleasant, abrupt person who is dangerous and careless and shouldn't be driving. And if I heard about anything else that he did, I would just be like, yeah, of course, that's that jerk that cut me off. I knew there's something wrong with him, right? So it's pretty clear to see that we tend to make those associations. And I mean, I'm sure that you make those associations. The problem is that more often than not, it's entirely false for us to do that. It's more likely that the person who cut you off didn't do it to be an asshole. Like, he probably, just like when you do it, he probably just wasn't quite paying attention. He was running late for a really important appointment, blah, blah, blah. The reasons why, for the most part, humanity does things tends to stay relatively stable across like nations. It's not just, across your country even. So the fact that we make these types of errors when we make attributions certainly can show you why it is that you'll have, that saying, there are three sides to every story. There's, your side, their side, and then the truth somewhere in between. And it's because we automatically make these inferences and these attributions. And so that actually colors our perception, because we're not just speaking about physically what we saw. Oftentimes, what we're doing is we're adding in implications of why they did what they did. So I just wanted to give you just this little story from the textbook here. So, blaming the victim, a consequence of the correspondence bias. So even if people are made aware of the situational factors responsible for the plight of disadvantaged members of our society, example, inadequate nutrition, disrupted family life, they may still see these individuals as responsible for their misfortune. So Guimond and Dubé in 1989, for example, found that the Anglophone students viewed Francophones themselves, rather than situational factors, as responsible for their lower economic status in Quebec. Another way in which the correspondence bias leads to victim blaming is when people decide that victims could have exercised control over a situation but didn't. So, for example, if someone comes down with, breast cancer, we tend not to blame them. We tend to throw drives and parades in the street, and they get a lot of support and sympathy. But when someone who is a current smoker is diagnosed with lung cancer, we're a lot more likely to kind of blame them and not really feel bad for them and kind of be like, well, it serves you right. And more importantly is that if they continue to smoke, I mean, that reaction goes up like tenfold. So, I mean, when you look at all of these things combined, you can take a look at the fact that we are a lot more likely to blame people that are in undesirable situations. We're more likely not only to blame them for being in those situations, but we're a lot more likely to actually attribute really negative personality characteristics and qualities to those people. So, for example, if you look at a neighborhood and the neighborhood is incredibly poor, there's a lot of people who are living, below the poverty line. There's a lot of crime going on, a lot of, drugs and guns and, stuff like that. And we will tend to look at even the small children or the very old and elderly who couldn't possibly be contributing to any of these things and certainly could not be at fault, but we will tend to paint them with that same paintbrush and decide that somehow they're at fault. If they really weren't criminals, if they really didn't love, staying down, if they really wanted to not be starving and not be living in a ghetto, then you know what? They would just get up and move. I've heard that argument a lot because, living under the poverty line to the point where you can't afford food makes it super easy for you to save up enough money for you to get up and, get first and last to move anywhere else, not to mention the actual cost of moving expenses, not to mention the fact that as you're trying to save up the money, you still have to pay the rent that you can barely afford and buy the food that you clearly can't afford enough of. God forbid you actually have children under those circumstances. It actually creates a cycle that's almost impossible to get out of unless you catch a break. But we don't think all of that through. What we do is, again, we blame the victim in that case. And then what we do is we attribute negative personality traits to the people who are there. So we decide that they're abrupt and that, we can't trust them, got to keep your purse close to you. They're probably violent. And so if, for example, we know someone's from one of those disadvantaged neighborhoods and they are dealing with customer service and they are reasonably upset and responding the way any reasonably upset person would, we will actually hear and perceive the language and the behavior that they're showing us, and we'll perceive it as being hostile and violent and angry and a whole bunch of things that we wouldn't if it was coming from any other person from any other neighborhood. But because we're looking at this person, we've actually attributed all of these characteristics to the person that aren't valid. So, obviously, this has huge implications towards why it is that, racism, prejudice, in general, sexism, a lot of these things are occurring and are still being perpetuated this day and age when it's like we know so much more than we did 200 years ago. Why are we still carrying around such outdated thoughts and opinions and beliefs and biases? But it's still something that exists because our brains are kind of hardwired to think a certain way. Our brains are sort of hardwired to, say, categorize things, for example, and to judge things at a quick instant because we can't spend all day, every day, considering every single aspect that our eyes pick up. If we did, it would take us 17 hours to get out of bed because we would have to stop and think about every part of what getting out of bed really meant. But with that being said, we've come so far. We have so much research available to us. The internet and any answer you want is just one click away. If you're really lazy, you don't even have to click. You can just use Siri or OK Google or whatever on your phone and just talk to it and it'll still search it for you. So, given all of that, we got to do better. We got to start recognizing these automatic ways that we perceive the world, and then we have to start working on actually changing those things. If we don't, we're going to be stuck in these same loops. And the sad thing is that we're actually holding ourselves and a whole bunch of people back by allowing ourselves as a greater population, as a greater nation, and even within our own household to be trapped by these mechanisms in our brains that evolved 10,000 years ago. Just a thought. Anyway, I'm Classic Ruby. I hope this kind of worked out. I hope it ends up being a little bit interesting, at least, because I love the psychology aspect. We're going to send it to some people, try it out, and if it sucks, no one will ever see it. And if it doesn't, then I guess some people will. All right, take care, guys. Cheers.